Well, thank you. I have to tell you that trying to stand in the shoes of David Wood is about the most terrifying thing I've done in recent years. And so I will do the best I can, but I have had the pleasure of speaking when he was moderating, and I know how terrific he is. But what I really want to focus on is the talk that we're going to hear today. Holly Tucker is, I think, really epitomizes what Vanderbilt is about. She is an associate professor of French and Italian. She was the associate director of our innovative program in medicine, health, and society. And because of the resources that are available at Vanderbilt that literally bring just about everything together in one place, she has written a phenomenal work that she's going to talk to you about called Blood Work, Medicine and Murder and Scientific Revolution. I get to do my Jon Stewart thing here. And I'll do this again at the end. This is a wonderful work. It's for sale, by the way, when you leave, but this is exactly what Vanderbilt is about. What Vanderbilt is about is really bringing all these various disciplines together so that we talk with one another, and so we really have a broad view of the challenges that are facing us today. And so without any further ado, let me introduce Holly Tucker.
Hi there, thanks. And thank you, Ellen, for stepping in last minute for David as well. You know, before I start, and you can tell, apparently there might have been a few groans as you were eating lunch at that image, sorry. Before I start, how many doctors and nurses do we have in the audience? Can you raise your hand? Okay, we have a few. Now, just leave your hands up for a second. And if you would, could you tell me how many of you could imagine modern medicine without the benefits of blood transfusion? Yeah, I don't see any more hands left. And that's one of the things I want to talk about today is blood transfusion and its very long history, and the ways in which we can look at that very long history and help that inform some of the thought processes that we are undergoing right now in our own modern moment of scientific revolution. So before I start, and I have to do this, I've been a long-time Red Cross volunteer and I believe mightily in the Red Cross, and it's a good idea for us to look at some of the statistics. Every 2 seconds, someone in the United States needs blood. The number of patients who receive blood in the US in a year, 5 million. Each donation, of course, can help save up to 3 lives, but only 3 out of 100 people who are eligible to donate actually donate. But you can tell by these numbers that blood transfusion is now part and parcel, right, of our modern medical experience. So much so, I love this, that we can't imagine a time in which we didn't have it as one of our tools in our toolboxes. What I'd like to do is talk about a moment when the idea of blood transfusion started. And the story goes back to the 17th century. We also take for granted that we all know about blood circulation. Blood circulation was not discovered until 1628 by William Harvey, and in doing that, he was radically rewriting understandings of the human body. From antiquity, 4th century before the Common Era, well before that, up to the 2nd century after the Common Era, representing Hippocrates and Galen, it was understood that the body was this murky mess of fluids called humors, and that we had humors like blood, phlegm, bile, black bile, and those mixed together to create a portrait of health. If those fluids were in balance, we were healthy. If they were not in balance, then we were sick. And so, since those fluids were not in balance, we had to tinker with them a little bit. So what's the one thing that you know about how we would tinker with things in the earlier periods? If you were a doctor, what's that? Leeches and bloodletting. Now the reason why we were using leeches and bloodletting is because we needed to get those humors back in balance. They didn't know that the blood moved through the body. William Harvey was wondering, well, okay, how are they understanding blood? How they understood that blood was made, this is actually from a 16th century illustration that represents the earlier periods of understanding the body. It's believed that blood was made through the digestive tract. perfectly appropriate since you're all having lunch. And that the food would get churned around, as they would call it, concocted, and then distilled into blood, and then it would move quickly through the body and then push its way up to the heart, where the blood would be burned off in a furnace-like thing. And the reason why we breathe is not because we need to bring oxygen into the blood. Rather, it's a way of stoking the fire, stoking the furnace, and blowing off some of the steam. Well, William Harvey said, well, wait a second. The heart beats X number of times per minute. We're breathing X number of times per minute. What he did is he started to do some dissections on animals and also some vivisections on animals, and he was able to measure the amount of blood in one of the chambers of the heart, did basic math and said, are you kidding me? We would have to make over 14 pounds of blood in a half hour? Something like that. There's no way that we could do that. We could make that blood and burn it off. So Harvey started to speculate then that there must be a system of circulation. What are these valves for? And he came up with this brilliant idea of blood circulation that revolutionized how the body was understood. It was also highly controversial, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, from circulation studies came now the need to test that information. We're now beginning the scientific revolution where we have these luminaries, particularly in England and France, who are rewriting essentially the rules of how we go through scientific endeavors. William Harvey presents the idea of circulation. Now we need to test it. One of the ways that you can test it is by doing infusion studies. So the next couple of decades after Harvey, we're going to find a lot of natural philosophers, the scientists as they were called, infusing all different types of liquors, literally, beer, wine, opium, milk, water, into the veins of animals to see what the effect is. And it was a way of proving circulation. So what is the next logical step, right? Is that we've figured out circulation. We've figured out that we need to, that it works by infusing animals. Well, now we start to think, well, what can we do with this? So the next step is then logically, and we're in the 17th century, keep in mind. That's over 250 years before the discovery of anesthesia, and I'm sorry, 150 years. Discovery of anesthesia and antisepsis. Keep this in mind, right? So we don't have a lot of painkillers as some of these studies that we're looking at. We know nothing about germ theory. So the next study is going to be blood transfusion. Well, the English were really hot on this. We have men like Robert Boyle, whom we call the father of chemistry, who's involved in this. Christopher Wren, who you all might know as one of the major architects, right? The major English architect. He's doing these transfusion studies. The Royal Society is now getting deeply engaged in it in London. They want the prize to do the first human transfusion. Well, they have a surprise, in fact, is they don't get to do it, but a Frenchman does it. And at this time, it's extraordinary to imagine that a Frenchman would do this because England and France are at war. It's pretty much the Cold War, not only a cold scientific war, but also literally a war. So it was unsettling to the English to have discovered blood circulation, worked through infusion, this close to doing the first human transfusions, and then a Frenchman does it. The first blood transfusions were animal to human. Gasp now. They were done before anesthesia, before antisepsis. And the first that we wonder, they were in a very short period of time for about 2-3 years. We say, why in the world were they using animals? Well, it makes sense in the 17th century. They don't know at this point anything about immunology. They see the effects of it when some of these go terribly wrong. But we're reaching for animals first because animals in this mindset are disposable. They're expendable, right? We don't have to worry about killing the donor because if the donor dies, unfortunately in the mindset of the 17th century, which is the moment that we start to see the rise of vivisection, these animals are disposable. But even more important and even better is they're better than human blood. Animal blood in this mindset is much better than human blood because animals don't drink, they don't smoke, they don't swear. And that was the rationale, right? And in this picture, you can see some of the first animal-human transfusions were from lamb. They were sheep. Why? Blood of God, right? Lamb of God, blood of Christ. Nothing could be more pure. So the story that I found as I was looking through this was of Jean-Baptiste Denis, who was that rebel-rousing Frenchman, actually loathed in Paris too, because he was not trained at the Paris Medical School. He was trained in the southern part of Montpellier, a rival school, considered the party school of medical practice. And people from Montpellier were not supposed to be doing innovative practices. Also, the Paris Medical School was extraordinarily conservative. They did not believe in circulation. They resisted mightily the idea of circulation. And so as much as we just take this as a matter of fact, because it was so revolutionary and because it was so cutting edge, right, and even unthinkable, the Paris Medical School was deeply engaged in humorism. They still believed in the humors. So they didn't even want to think about blood transfusion because that would make them think about infusion, which would make them think about circulation, and that was the most ridiculous idea they'd ever heard. So Jean-Baptiste Denis, our renegade transfusionist, does 3 experiments. The first, this is in 1667. He's brought to a home of a young boy who's been suffering of a fever for about 2 months, pays the mother, infuses the young boy with lamb's blood. It works, supposedly. Now, some of these things may have worked. I've talked to many of my colleagues over at Vanderbilt in immunology. It all depends on the amount, the speed, and whether you've had prior exposure to the blood. And they're using actually duck quills, right? And they're not using any anticoagulants. They don't know about those until 1914. So it's very likely that not huge amounts of blood could have gotten into these patients, but still. The second transfusion actually was the butcher who provided the lamb for the first transfusion of the young boy. And the transfusionist was mightily disturbed by it because the butcher wanted the money. He wanted to go to the tavern and drink. And I have some wonderful historical records and archival records where the transfusionist is walking down the busy streets of Paris, peeks into one of the taverns. There's the butcher he just transfused, and he's drunk off his... He's drunk. The transfusionist goes into the bar to yell at the guy, and all of these drunken workers come up to him and say, hey, give me one of those. Hey, give me one of those. He looks really great. I want one of these blood transfusions. So Jean-Baptiste Denis knew that he was on to something, and he was also starting to get a great reputation in a city that actually rejected his kind, right, of those who would have trained at the rival school. So he decides to do the most radical procedure yet. There was a man named Antoine Mauroy who had worked as a valet for one of the most illustrious women in Paris. And she had people in, the whole literary elite came to Madame de Sévigné's home. Mauroy was a very low birth man, lived out in the villages, and you can imagine from going to the bottom rungs of society to the very upper rungs of society, he falls in love with the lady in waiting, and he thinks he's going to be able to marry her. Well, of course, he's delusional. There's no way that a man of that birth can marry a woman of that birth. He ends up having his heart broken, and according to the documents, the story goes is that he ended up going crazy. So Denis knows, I have one of the most famous men in Paris because he worked for one of the most famous women in Paris, and he has one of the most famous stories because he is brokenhearted and has now lost his mind and is now running through the streets of Paris naked, screaming all the time. So Denis decides on a cold day in 1667 that he's going to pluck Mauroy off the streets, pull him in to the home of actually his patron, and transfuse him with, this time, cow's blood. The first experiment works, or at least it seems to work. Wakes up, the guy wakes up the next morning, is whistling, is happy. The priest actually comes in, thinking he's going to be giving this man his last rites. The priest said, I don't know what happened. He's of sound mind. He can actually take the sacrament. The man's wife comes in and says, I don't recognize him. I really don't recognize him. Well, Denis tries 2 more experiments. Second one goes well, third one, he dies. He's then put up on murder charges. So as I was looking through these documents, I thought to myself, well, this is interesting. What an interesting case. They're putting animal blood into these people. And I started to look at the court cases, and I started to look at some of the readings by historians over the decades and even centuries about this case. Well, they all said, of course he needed to be put up on murder charges because this was an extraordinarily dangerous procedure. And of course it makes sense that the result of this murder case is that transfusion was definitively banned in France and then later in England and across Europe because it was so dangerous. But what struck me as I looked at these records, I was actually working at the Humanities Center at Vanderbilt. You want to talk about great resources. Had I not been able to be part of that a fellows group there, I don't think I would be talking to you today about it. I started digging through all this stuff, and it turns out Denis was exonerated for the murder, but the court record said that the patient had been murdered, and the patient had been murdered by a few other physicians. And the physicians were unnamed. Thought, why in the world has no historian ever looked at the identity? Why would somebody want to murder this patient, right? And also for blood transfusion, it's something that we just take absolutely for granted now. What was it about this case that would lead a set of physicians to murder a patient? It turns out that the answer is strangely convoluted and makes strange sense all at the same time. Now we can imagine you're putting animal blood into humans. You can also imagine that we have to worry perhaps about contagion. What precisely are we putting in there? This is hitting at exactly the same time that a philosopher named René Descartes, many of you probably recognize that as I think, therefore I am guy. René Descartes put out yet another controversial idea at about the same time HARVEY is putting out his controversial idea of blood circulation. He says that the body and the soul are distinct in that human bodies and animal bodies are more or less, they function identically because they function as if they were machines. The only difference between, according to Descartes, the only difference between humans and animals is that humans have souls, and those souls are non-corporeal. They're not part of the body. They're not in our flesh. So somebody like Denis can have no problem moving animal blood into human bodies because what are you moving? Well, you're just sort of putting new oil in the machine, right? You're changing the oil in your car. But what if Descartes was wrong? And that was the big philosophical question. What if there was something more in the blood? What if the soul were actually in the blood? As we can also read in biblical text as well. So we've got traditional ways of viewing things, radical ways of viewing things, and then we've got a man who's testing it out. At the same time, we're at the scientific revolution, which is the period of extraordinary travel, new world travel. People are going all over to every part of the planet, into the new world, into Asia, and they're coming back with these stories of beasts. You can only imagine what it would be like for a European to see an elephant or a giraffe for the first time, right? They're seeing new animals, new flora, new fauna, right? New people for the very first time, and they're trying to make sense of it. And they come back with some really wacky stories. This is one of my favorites. For some of you in the back, you may not be able to see it, but the bodies are sort of men, sort of dogs, but it's the kingdom of dog-headed men. These early travelers would come back swearing that they saw a whole colonies of dog-headed men or human-faced sheep, right? The idea that hybrid beings could exist was really frightening and deeply fascinating for the mindset of the time period that I'm studying. So the problem is now with these early blood transfusions, they think animal-human hybrids really do and can exist. And now science may have an ability to engineer them. This has got to be stopped. This absolutely has to stop. So fundamentally, what's happening in the early 17th century, mid to late 17th century, around blood transfusion, what's happening, some extraordinary debates between science and society about whether we're going to let certain experiments continue or not. One of the prime people in this is Robert Boyle. I mentioned him, father of early chemistry. He writes a whole long list of what we would see as hypotheses, early representations of the scientific method, saying, I wonder, let's do some experiments to test it. So he has a list of about 25 of these. One of them is, and toward the end is, I wonder if by frequently transfusing the blood of some animal into another species, something further and more tending to some degrees of a change of species may be affected. It's a logical question given everything that we've already talked about, right? And he says, I don't think so. I don't think this is possible, but it is worthwhile for satisfaction and curiosity to determine the point by experiments. So we have one group of people saying, you know, this is part of what we need to do. This is the dawn of early science. We need to be able to explore these questions. Even if we don't think something like this could happen, we need to know this is what we do as natural philosophers. This is what we do as scientists. But as the resounding ban after the DENIS trial, it was fascinating to research this because it read just like one of the best crime novels you could ever. The guy ended up being murdered by arsenic, and I'm not going to tell you who did it because part of the fun of reading these documents is trying to figure it out myself, and then hopefully you'll also have fun figuring out with me if you have a chance to read the book. But blood transfusion was banned. Actually, not technically banned. It was the court said that no further human transfusions can be done without the explicit approval of the Paris Faculty of Medicine. Paris Faculty of Medicine were and against circulation. They were against transfusion. They didn't like the guy who was doing the transfusion. For all practical purposes, it was banned. It ended up going up to appeal to the highest court in France. It was definitively banned. And by that time, the English were just so fed up with the entire thing, frankly. They had been scooped, they were mad, they were frustrated. They started to move on to other projects. Why get into this whole messy thing? They stopped doing them. There were transfusions that were done also in Italy, done. We don't see more transfusions until the 19th century. The transfusions begin again in England in an obstetrics ward. Dr. Blundell starts seeing so many new mothers hemorrhaging, and he is deeply, deeply overwrought by this, that he starts bringing in husbands and also hospital workers and tries to do some early experiments hooking up husbands to their wives. Not a lot of success. He didn't do a lot. He maybe did 10 of these, but it starts society and scientists thinking, maybe we should start picking this up again. Additional things happen, discovery of anesthesia, discovery of antisepsis, and in 1901, blood types were finally discovered, and interestingly, it was a simple experiment. A simple experiment. All Karl Landsteiner did, he was an Austrian, is took several of his lab buddies and said, hey, give me some of your blood, you give me some of your blood, you give me some of your blood, and he's like, okay, John, does your blood clot when it's up against Mike's blood? Oh, it does, but it doesn't clot up against Larry's blood. And he starts to be able to isolate some blood type hypotheses. Those were tested, and so we have only in the early 20th century the discovery of blood types. 1914, sodium citrate is used to keep blood from coagulating, which means that you can now use blood remotely. You don't need to have the donor hooked up to the recipient. And the first blood banks were established. The first one was in Russia. The next were in Chicago. Cook County Hospital was the first American blood bank that was established. In 1941, the American Red Cross, of course we can see the dates, Second World War, establishes the National Blood Service. So what's interesting to me as I tell and talk about this really twisted history of early blood transfusion is how far we had to travel to get to that first slide, right? And how things that we now take for granted as not being an overly, and for most communities, overly fraught procedure, pretty much terrified an entire society to the point that some would resort to murder to stop it. So I know the title of this talk looked really big, and it's really hard to make a talk that big in just 20 minutes, but my big questions about where we are in our modern age, a moment, I would say as well, a moment of scientific revolution. We now have tools of understanding the body through, for example, genetics that we didn't have before. And it gets at the same questions, I believe, of the limits and the possibilities of science, the conflicts that exist between science and society, right? And I think it gets to three important questions that are for me, as someone who works in history, when I'm not a bioethicist, I'm not a scientist, I work in history, but with my historical ears, I'm listening to all the debates that are happening right now, and I just can't help think about my guys in the 17th century. Specifically, they were asking the same questions that we are asking or need to be asking. Should a society set limits on its science? If so, how? And at what price? I'd like to think about all of the lives that could have been saved, and also probably a lot of lives that would have been lost in the experimental process, had blood transfusion been allowed to continue whatever course it was going to take instead of being banned. But then finally, this is the question that fascinates me, is if we look ahead, how will history be judging us? What type of story will somebody like me, after I'm long dead, come and be telling a group like you after we're not here? So there you have it. I'd love to hear your questions, and if you, I saved the gory slides for you though. So the question was, in the 17th century, what did the church have to say about blood transfusions? It was, interestingly enough, they're pretty hands-off. They're letting the Paris Faculty of Medicine do their work because particularly the Paris Faculty of Medicine says they're all Catholic, and so they say, well, absolutely not, we don't want it. And the church doesn't really have to make any unilateral statement for, especially against. It's interesting that the English, of course, are Protestants, and they're very interested in blood transfusion because in Protestant scientific practice, much more than in the Catholic practices, there's a greater interest in transmutation and alchemical studies. And Paracelsin, which is a sort of a fringe scientific community, they're deeply interested in that because if they can transmutate base metals into gold, or they're hoping that they can. Boyle was actually also an alchemist, that maybe they could be doing the very same thing with blood. So there's a diarist named Samuel Pepys who had just a delightful thing. He goes, you know what, this blood transfusion thing, he's English Protestant, this blood transfusion thing's pretty cool. I wonder if we could transfuse some blood into an archbishop and make him a Quaker. Oh, there you are.
From the historical perspective, people are now checking their DNA to see their family history and everything. Does, and you may not know the answer to this, does a blood transfusion change the DNA of a person?
You know, I'm going to defer to my colleague who's a doctor, but Ellen, if they do blood marrow transplants, can't you be a have chimerism?
So the answer is that at least for a brief period after you get any blood transfusion, you will have foreign DNA inside you. Red cells don't have DNA, but white cells do, and you can't get rid of all of them. If if it works, you will actually have completely foreign DNA inside of you. So when we do a blood transfusion on a patient, there are certain blood tests that we can't do for several weeks after that until they clear the foreign blood. Great question.
So a person's checking their family history, that might be a word of caution. There've been a lot of blood transfusions in the family.
Well, since mostly you spit when you do these tests, I'm not sure that having a blood transfusion changes what you spit. I mean, I've done this fairly recently, so I haven't had a blood transfusion recently either, so I'm not quite sure. But that's an interesting question. But if you were just doing blood, it would absolutely make a difference. There's a question down here.
Do dogs have different type, like, or any other animal? I'm not talking about across animals, but you did a certain species of dog. Would they all be the same?
I actually had a vet. I was going to say a vet my book. I actually had a veterinarian. Oh, the question, I'm sorry, is asking about blood types in dogs, for example. I had a veterinarian take a look at what I was writing because there are so many different dog transfusions that happen. And there was one set of French transfusionists who were trying desperately to get canine to canine transfusions to work, and they all failed. But the Jean-Baptiste DENIS, who is my primary transfusionist, he was getting his to work. So I took this stuff to a veterinarian and I said, hey, help me with this. And they said, well, I see my research assistant, Jared, how many blood types are there in dogs? 8? Is that what it was? 8. Dogs have about 8 different types, and it all depends on, again, how much, how fast, whether there's been prior exposure. And that information was very helpful because with the veterinarian, we looked at some of these dog cases, and it turns out this one group of French doctors who were affiliated with the Paris Medical School, it looks like they were reusing their dogs in their transfusions. So it might have worked okay on the first one, but if they transfuse the same dog into the same recipient, then the dog would die. And that's why greyhounds, if I'm understanding that right, are considered universal donors. There is a universal donor blood for dogs.
How did they ever have success at all when they didn't know anything about
So the question is, how did they have any success at all when they didn't know anything about blood types? I think that's a really fair question, and that was one that I kept on scratching my head on. But again, it goes back to the really rudimentary systems that they were using. I don't know how much blood, I don't think they knew how much blood was getting into these animals. There's one experiment that they did I thought was great, is that they weighed both dogs, and then they did the transfusion. They did the transfusion on scales. That's what it was. And so they took the blood out of one, and they weighed the other one, hopefully trying to figure out. And the scales that they were using once, little weights and stuff. And they still really couldn't say, okay, I think we got 10 ounces maybe. But I doubt that they did that much because much of it was sort of flowing down the tubes and spurting all over the place anyway. Sorry.
There's a question over there. Okay, over here.
This is really just a comment about the woman's question about this transfusion. I think her question was sort of transform the genetics of the kind of solid portion of the body. Was that sort of the question over here? And I would suspect that was a question that folks had centuries ago and a fear centuries ago. I think the answer to that is no, but I could see how that would be a confusing, gosh, when you infuse something in me that's going to change the core of my body, which I think there's still fear of that today, and I think the answer to that's no, but I think it is an interesting discussion point. I don't know if you have a comment about it, but I wondered if that was what she was getting at with the question.
Well, and actually, there are some non-transfusion debates that are going on, particularly in the late Middle Ages, when you have the Crusades. There's this one treatise that says, okay, so we have a Christian crusader who goes and conquers, right, Muslim. So he kills the Muslim, eats him, then comes back, has sex with his wife. Is that baby, what faith is that baby? And so So these are real discussions when the whole idea of ingesting, whether it's through food or through fluids, this whole sense of how contained is the human body really, and what types of cultural fears. I think, yeah, you're right. My sense is that's what that question was too. The whole cultural fears about the integrity of the body. Is what is mine really mine when you start putting other stuff in it? Is that what you were thinking too?
There was a question up here, I think. Okay, there you go. Okay, and then one there. Yes, sir.
We live in a phenomenal era of space exploration. I know that there have been many, many things scientifically that have been discovered, and a lot of questions have been resolved in space. Now, has this also occurred with blood experimentation? Do you know?
Can you make the question a little bit, hone in a little bit more?
Well, what experimentation has done with blood, and what have been the results, if we know them, in space?
Oh, I wouldn't know how to answer that. But I can tell you that there's still so many questions that we have about blood, and there's so many, I would say, places of the Wild West that we still need to look at. One of the big quests right now, one of the big holy grails, if you will, is to see if we can actually bypass blood entirely, is to see if we have a possibility of actually creating artificial blood products that would make it so that we can actually use them on battlefields, et cetera. Now, it was highly controversial. In fact, there was a huge debate in the American Medical Association a couple of years ago about whether or not certain studies would actually go as far as FDA approval. And it looks like that's tapered down a lot, but that's always been the quest. I think that's why they were injecting opium as well, and beer and blood and other things to see. I mean, what can we put in our veins that would also work like blood? So I think there's still, if you talk to any hematologist, there's so many different. There are thousands upon thousands of mysteries that we just have not resolved when it comes to this vital fluid.
Thank you.
Oh, there's a question right there. Yes.
I'd be curious to see the parallels in societal debate in the 17th century about medical research and today.
Mm-hmm. You notice I bypassed those questions, right? I think they're vitally there. I can't help but think about all of the debates surrounding embryological stem cell research. And I do have to tell you that one of, and I may just read it, first let me preface as we start to move into these thorny debates, is my job as a professor at Vanderbilt University, a humanist, is not to come up with the answers. That's the cool part of my job, is what I try to do is to come up with thought points and questions that are really productive and interesting, and to make sure that there's a space in our discussions for every voice to be heard. And so, as I mentioned this, I started this book in 2006, and it started, I still remember the day. George Bush, in his State of the Union address, called for, and I'm quoting, legislation to prohibit the most egregious abuses of medical research, including creating human-animal hybrids. And I went, wait, I've seen those hybrids before. And I started to watch on the internet in the days that followed the cultural responses, right? The cultural responses are exactly the same responses I was looking at. Wow, look at these cool, like, dog-faced humans. This is really cool. Or, oh, this is absolutely an insult to the great chain of being and the way we understand the relationship between God and humanity, right? Science has gone out of control. And then there were also some neat cartoons and stuff. I thought, how very interesting. And I started to dig around, and there was a report in the Council on Bioethics, Presidential Council on Bioethics in 2004, in which there was a line that I thought, it was all about animal to human, not human embryonic stem cell research, animal to human embryonic stem cell research, and this dates well back to 2004, is that we needed to put some contours around this to prevent, I'm quoting, to prevent some adventurous or renegade researchers from doing untold damage to human species. I think that there are some really fundamental overlaps that I'm seeing in the 17th century debates around blood transfusion and what we're seeing around embryological stem cell research. And what's interesting to me, as far as for uncomfortable and as loud as many of these debates have become, is that there are many of the same voices, right? Many of the same responses. And that gives me a lot of comfort, actually, because what that means is that our response in the debates and discussions that we're having right now over controversial practices that would pit science and society against one another, is that these types of discussions have to happen for us to be able to move forward as a society and for us to be able to move forward and to decide how much we want science to be doing and not to be doing. And if we say, oh, you're one of those people who thinks it's really cool to see dog-faced men walking around the planet and you scare the heck out of me, I'm not even going to talk to you, or we're just going to shout on news TV, is that we're doing ourselves a disservice. What we have to do is to find, what they didn't do in the 17th century, is we have to find a place where we can have calm, coherent, respectful, and logical debates with one another that allow us to be able to move forward, recognizing that these different stances are part and parcel of what we need to do. So I hope did I answer your question? Okay, did I dance around it enough? But I leave it to actually people like Dr. Clayton, who presents on the Council for, you were just doing something, the
Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues on Monday.
And we need to leave it to the more informed bioethicists, physicians, scientists, and then also to representatives from the other interest groups to be able to have those very calm, measured discussions.
Are those kind of questions not based on fear? So that you're really not dealing with rational thinking, you're dealing with a lot of fears that unfortunately still exist and will probably continue since they've existed this long.
Very likely, but again, I think that's natural and normal, right? Change brings discomfort and fear. But to say it's only fear is to diminish the significance of it. I also think to even just say science versus society is a reductivist way of looking at it, because we have a tendency to see science, I'm not a scientist, right? But as I listen to what happens on TV or read the newspapers, is that we have certain preconceptions about what these scientists do. Some of them are mad, some of them don't care, some of them dive through. I do happen to have a lot of friends who are scientists. I'm looking at a couple over there. And I know that they're deeply committed to pursuing the truth. And not just for figuring out how they can manipulate nature, but really as a way to allow us all to enjoy more full lives, right? So, yeah, there's fear, but it's a very, as we saw here, it's a very complicated sociological process that goes on.
I would like to ask you to say what role history ought to play in shaping our current debates. You know, those who say that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I mean, and we're repeating it. So how can we actually bring the humanist perspective and the historical perspective to bear in these really contentious scientific debates?
That's a good question. What I've noticed is that history's been there all along. But most of the time, I tend to see it as a forward narrative, is, oh, look how funny and silly they were, but we know better, right? They didn't know these things. And so it's a way of validating ourselves and I would think an arrogant way of seeing the world. and of course my answer to this is that history is critical. History is absolutely critical, and it's just not about the dates and the names, right? It's about the, as I've been trying to talk about, it's the way of understanding and getting some comfort from, I think, too, how other moments of time have dealt with tricky issues, right? Not just around the things that ended up being right or successful, right? Blood transfusion ended up being something we were going to use. But also those things where it seemed like a good idea, there was a debate around it, it didn't work. We need to look at those as well. What are your thoughts, Ellen? I would be interested in hearing from you as the more scientific side of it. What are your thoughts?
Well, I guess I asked you that question because I knew what I thought the answer was.
And did I answer it the way?
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, it's absolutely essential. I mean, I think that, you know, I think that, so, I mean, my thought about it is not, again, it's not productive to say how silly they were, but rather to say that it really enlightens or brings forward the social context of medicine and the social context in which this is all going forward. And unless we pay attention to that and really look at, you know, what people are really worried about and pay attention to that, then we're not going to get anywhere. I mean, I think that's, so, you know, your other point that you talked about here was the concern about hybridity. You know, the idea of chimeras, which, you know, if you look in the public imagination, the idea of man-anything combinations has been something that's terrified people for millennia. I mean, people don't like dog man. And so, but I think that sort of identifying that fear, but then thinking about some of the other things that we're talking about currently in medicine, for instance, coming up with solid organs from other animals that can have human antigens on their surfaces so that can be used for organ transplantation. I mean, that's an interesting issue. It would be nice not to have a shortage of livers and kidneys. And so how do we think about, and it goes to exactly the point that you were talking about there. So, you know, so my own view, and the reason I said yes, besides the fact that she asked me, was that I actually think thinking about history is essential. And it for no other reason than it makes us have some humility about the questions to say, oh yeah, it's actually more complicated than what we're talking about. So, I mean, that's why I.
Well, and if I can jump in, I have another favorite quote, actually, that I want to share, because the road's going both ways. And I think that's something that's been really reductivist in the news, is that you know, scientists are the scientists, however you want to define it, are off in their corners, and they're getting ready to do all of this stuff, and they don't really care about all of these things. That's not true. And I know at a place like Vanderbilt, that's fundamentally not true. There's a quote by Alan Leshner, came out a couple of years ago. Chair, president, what is he? Yeah, American Association for the Advancement of Science. He wrote a really great opinion piece a couple years ago. For many scientists, any overlay of values on the conduct of science is anathema to our core principles and our historic success. Within the limits of ethical conduct of science with human or animal subjects, many believe that no scientifically answerable question should be out of bounds. And he goes on to say that, but when research touches on the essence and origins of human life, it is more important than ever that science and society interact in open and rational dialogue. I think that really hits at how the balance for the quest of knowledge, it looks an awful lot like Boyle's, Robert Boyle's quote. So I have all of these questions I want to ask, and I really, really want to be able to explore them to the fullest by experiment. And it also, this quote also recognizes that we all have a stake in this, right? And we need to make it a playing field where we can all have a voice in it.
So, yes, sir.
In your example of the French court and transfusion, you said that the
Mhm.
and legally made that the requirement. Today, there are people who are not saying don't do it, they're saying don't do it with tax money. Do you see a difference?
So the question is funding. Funding was critical, and funding is still extraordinarily critical.
But all research is not done with tax money.
Well,
Majority is not done with tax money.
But there is still a significant amount that is not done with tax money.
well, and there is a significant amount of research that's moving out of the United States, so it can be done. Is that not right?
So, and I'll respond to that for a minute and just say that you in fact want research done with tax money because the oversight is so much more intense. I actually think most scientists are in that last paragraph. Most understand that doing research is a sacred trust, that doing things that would not be to the benefit of humanity is not okay. And this is my experience. I think what you actually want is you want public accountability and transparency. So you would prefer it. That's that's not what our public discourse is now, but certainly with the debate about human embryonic stem cells, I mean, there's a lot of public pressure to, be careful about how that research is done. But you can guarantee that were it done with federal dollars, we would know a whole lot more about it than we do otherwise. Oh, and, yes, ma'am.
You were talking about
Can we get a microphone for you?
they went to Africa and seen elephants and giraffes and all this stuff. Because they got the idea of the dog-faced men from the hieroglyphics on the walls.
I'm not really sure about that, but boy, did they come back with unbelievable things. In fact, same time period is also the very beginnings of the first museums, right? That's how museums were created, is all of these New World travelers pillaged, right, the places where they were going, and they came back with all these cool trinkets, whether they were skeletons or seashells this big or spears from African tribesmen, and they didn't know quite what to do with all this new knowledge and all these new things. So they created these, what they were called cabinets of wonder, where they would put them all on display and then try to organize and catalog them. In fact, one of those, the very beginnings of the British Museum was from a cabinet of curiosity from a guy named Sloane. And if you go to London and you go to the British Museum, you can find his cabinet of curiosity, and it's a marvel. I spent 6 hours in there one day because it's all these unbelievable artifacts. So I don't know where they got these ideas, but they're coming back with new experiences that they can only put them into their current mindset. In fact, I say this to my undergraduate students all the time, is that the questions we can ask about something, they're necessarily coded by the framework, the worldview in which we're seeing our world. There are certain questions that we can't ask right now because we're living in a certain way of seeing the world. And I use the example of pre-September 11th and post-September 11th. I can't even begin thinking some of the things that how I've been seeing the world 2010, September 10th, right? And so if the worldview codes the questions that we're able to ask, then necessarily that dictates the answers we get. So what now happens as you go out into new worlds and the world paradigm, the worldview is changing, and you're coming back with an African spear. You're trying to just shove that into your old way of thinking, and it's nearly impossible, right? So they spend so much time trying to catalog it to make sense out of it. So long story short, now the history of museums is fascinating.
Well, I think, okay, one last question.
Thank you. I was just curious, in fact, is there any compatibility of the blood of humans and other animals, like mammals, even more specifically primates?
Ellen?
There's probably some, but I certainly don't think that anybody would want to transfuse one to the other. Please join me in thanking Professor Tucker for an incredible talk.